The first thing he noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, the quiet that settles in when you're content and alone. This was a heavy silence, a thick wool blanket of nothingness that seemed to absorb the sound of his own breathing, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant, muffled thrum of the city at 2 a.m. It was the silence of an empty apartment, a silence that had a weight to it, a physical presence in the room that pressed down on his chest until he had to consciously remember to take another breath. This was his life now, this heavy, suffocating quiet, and in the middle of it he became aware of another sound, so faint it was almost part of the silence itself, a soft, almost imperceptible scrape against the other side of his front door. It had been going on for 3 weeks. Every night. Like clockwork. He'd be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster with his eyes, trying and failing to quiet the noise in his own head. And he'd hear it, a gentle rustle, the quietest thud, the soft exhalation of a creature settling down on the worn welcome mat he never used. At first he'd thought it was the wind, maybe a loose piece of trash skittering down the hallway of his low-rent apartment building. But the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic. They had a pattern. They had a purpose, so on the 4th night he'd gotten up. The floorboards were cold under his bare feet. He'd moved slowly, cautiously, not turning on any lights, his own heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears, a drumbeat against the oppressive quiet. He'd pressed his eye to the peephole, the world outside distorting into a fisheye view of the empty, poorly lit hallway. And there she was. A small, shadowy lump curled right up against the crack at the bottom of his door, as if trying to siphon the faint warmth from his apartment. A cat, a creature of nothing but bone and matted fur, her spine a sharp, delicate ridge you could almost see through her patchy coat. She wasn't sleeping. Her eyes were open, 2 pools of reflected green light in the darkness, staring right back at the peephole, as if she knew he was there. He'd jumped back, his heart doing a funny little stutter. A stray, of course. The neighborhood was full of them, skittish ghosts living in the alleys, surviving on garbage and fear. He'd seen them from his window, darting under parked cars, their movements quick and furtive. But this one had chosen his door. Night after night. He didn't know why. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. It wasn't near the garbage chute. There was no reason for her to be here. In this specific spot, outside this specific door, belonging to this specific man who felt as broken and discarded as she looked. His name was Leo. And he was, if he was being honest with himself, not okay. He'd moved into this apartment 2 months ago, after the divorce papers were signed and everything he thought was his life was neatly divided into boxes. The boxes were still mostly unpacked. The walls were bare. The air still smelled of stale paint in someone else's life. He went to work, he came home, he ordered takeout, he stared at the walls. He was a ghost in his own home, haunting the empty rooms, and the silence was his constant, heavy companion. Maybe that's why he didn't shoo her away. Maybe on some level, he recognized a fellow ghost, something that also moved through the world without making a sound, trying to take up as little space as possible. The next night he'd left a small saucer of tuna just inside his door. He'd opened the door slowly, an inch at a time, but she was gone in a flash, a blur of movement and vanished shadow. He'd closed the door, waited, and listened. For 10 minutes, nothing. Then the softest sounds of eating. A delicate crunching, a quiet lap of a tongue. He'd felt a strange, unwelcome pang of something, connection. It was the first intentional thing he'd done for another living thing in weeks. It felt foreign. It felt necessary, and so a routine began. Every evening around the same time, he'd place a small offering outside his door. A bit of chicken from his dinner, a scoop of canned sardines he bought specifically for her, a bowl of fresh water. He'd retreat back inside, and within minutes he'd hear the careful, tentative approach. She never ate while he was watching. She was a creature of the shadows of the in-between times. He started calling her Shadow, not out loud, just in his head. She's here, he'd think, listening to the soft sounds from the hallway. My shadow is here. He began to learn her through the door. He knew the sound of her settling down after she'd eaten, the soft whump of her body hitting the worn mat. He knew the sound of her washing herself, a rough, sandpapery rhythm that would sometimes lull him to sleep. He knew her quiet, almost silent meow, not a cry for food, but more like a sigh, a confirmation of her presence. He found himself looking forward to it. The heavy silence of the apartment felt a little less heavy knowing that just on the other side of that thin sheet of wood, there was another heartbeat, a small, feral, frightened heart keeping time with his own. He started talking to her through the door. Just whispers at first. "Hey there, Shadow. It's cold out tonight, huh? I had a rotten day." The words felt strange in his mouth, rusty from disuse, but it felt good to say them, to send them out into the world, even if the only one hearing them was a cat who likely didn't understand a word of it. Or maybe she did. Maybe she understood the tone, the loneliness that clung to every syllable. Sometimes when he'd talk, the washing sound would stop. She'd go quiet as if listening, and that was enough. It was more than enough. 3 weeks in, and something shifted. It was a Tuesday. It had been raining all day, a cold, relentless autumn rain that seeped into your bones. Leo came home from work soaked and miserable, his shoes squelching on the linoleum floor. The apartment felt darker than usual, colder. The silence felt like a verdict. He'd eaten a cold sandwich for dinner, not even bothering to heat up soup. He'd placed Shadow's portion of sardines outside the door and collapsed onto his couch, not even having the energy to make it to the bedroom. He must have fallen asleep there, the sound of the rain tapping against the window pane a dreary lullaby. He woke with a start. The room was pitch black. The digital clock on the microwave glowed 3:47 a.m. The rain had stopped. And the silence was back, that awful, heavy silence. But something was different. He felt it before he understood it. There was no soft rustle from the hallway, no gentle sigh. The space outside his door felt empty. A cold dread, sudden and irrational, washed over him. Had she left? Had she finally decided his meager offerings weren't enough? Had something happened to her? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twist in his gut. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to depend on her silent nightly vigil. She was the one thread tethering him to something outside of his own grief, and now she was gone. He got up, his body stiff and cold. He didn't turn on the light. He walked to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. He pressed his eye to the peephole. Nothing, just the empty, dimly lit hallway. The dread solidified into a hard, cold knot in his stomach. He was alone. Truly alone. Again. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, closing his eyes. The loss felt disproportionate, ridiculous. It was just a stray cat, but it wasn't. It was the one thing he'd allowed himself to care about, and now it was gone. He didn't know how long he stood there. A minute? 5. Finally, with a sigh that came from the very depths of that heavy silence, he reached for the doorknob. Maybe she'd left a mess. Maybe he should just bring the empty saucer inside. He turned the knob and pulled the door open, the hinges giving a soft, familiar creak. The saucer was there, licked clean. But that's not what made his breath catch in his throat. That's not what made his heart stop its frantic beating and instead give one single, hard, painful thud, lying directly in the center of the clean, white saucer placed with a deliberate, heartbreaking precision was a small, sodden, and perfectly dead sparrow. Its tiny feathers were matted from the rain, its eyes closed. It looked peaceful in a way. It had been placed there, not dropped. It was an offering, a gift, left in the exact spot where he always left her food. Leo stared, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a leftover from a meal. She hadn't eaten it. She had brought it. She had hunted it in the cold, pouring rain and carried it back here to his door, and she had left it for him. A reciprocal gift. Payment for the sardines. A thank you. Or something more. Something deeper, something primal. An animal's attempt to provide for the human who had been providing for her. To take care of him because she sensed on some instinctual level that he needed taking care of. He slowly sank to his knees there in the doorway, the cold from the hallway floor seeping through his pajama pants. He didn't touch the bird. He just stared at it, this tiny, pathetic, beautiful gift. And for the first time since he'd moved into this silent, empty apartment, since his life had fractured into a million pieces, Leo put his face in his hands and cried. Not the quiet, stifled tears he'd cried into his pillow, but great, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. They were tears of grief for the life he'd lost, but also tears of a bewildering, overwhelming gratitude. This small, feral creature who asked for nothing but a few scraps of food had seen his loneliness. She had recognized the hollowed-out silence inside him, and she had responded with the only language she knew, the language of offering, the language of I see you, I am here. You are not alone, he cried until he had no tears left. He sat back, wiping his face with the sleeve of his shirt, his breath still coming in ragged hitches. He looked at the little bird again, and he understood. This changed everything. This wasn't just a stray cat sleeping outside his door anymore. This was the beginning of something. He didn't know what, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep into his bones that his life was no longer just his own. A thread had been connected, fragile and thin as a spider's silk, but stronger than steel. It was tied to a small bony shadow of a cat, and he knew, right then and there, kneeling on the cold floor in the dead of night, that he would do anything to never break it. You're here, listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The little bird was gone by morning. Leo hadn't moved it. He'd left it there in the saucer, that strange and sacred offering, and had finally gone back to bed, sleep claiming him in a deep, dreamless wave for the first time in months. When he woke to the gray light of a November dawn, he'd approached the door with a kind of reverence, a nervousness fluttering in his own chest, a mirror of the little heart that had stopped beating. He'd opened the door slowly, half expecting, half fearing it would still be there, but it was gone. The saucer was gone too. All that was left was a single damp gray feather stuck to the worn welcome mat. It was as if the entire night had been a dream, a vivid emotional hallucination born from loneliness and grief. But the feather was real, and the hollow, aching feeling in his chest from crying so hard was real, and the memory of that small, sodden gift was etched into his mind, permanent and undeniable. Something had fundamentally shifted. The air felt different. The silence in the apartment, while still present, had lost some of its weight. It was no longer a verdict. It was just quiet, and on the other side of the door, he knew, was a reason for that quiet to be broken. He went about his day in a haze, his mind constantly drifting from his computer screen at work, pulling up the image of the bird, the feel of the cold floor under his knees, the raw scrape of his own sobs. He found himself in the pet aisle at the grocery store on his way home, staring at the endless rows of cat food. He felt like an imposter. He wasn't a cat owner. He was just a guy, a lonely guy who fed a stray. But he reached for a can anyway. Not the cheap generic stuff. The expensive kind, with a picture of a glossy, healthy cat on the label. Salmon and shrimp dinner. It felt ridiculous. It felt necessary. That evening, the ritual felt new. He didn't just slide a saucer of leftovers outside. He carefully opened the can, the metallic thwick-pop sound echoing in his quiet kitchen. He spooned the pungent, pink-flecked food into the clean saucer. He even smoothed the top with the back of the spoon, a gesture so domestic, so tender, it surprised him. He placed the saucer down in the exact same spot, right in the center of the mat. He hesitated for a moment. Then he did something he'd never done before. He left the door open. Just a crack, an inch, maybe two, an invitation. A terrifying, exhilarating risk. Then he retreated to his couch, picking up a book he hadn't touched in months, pretending to read. His entire body was tense, every nerve ending tuned to the hallway. He could hear the hum of the building, the distant sound of a television, the sigh of the elevator down the hall. He waited. He heard her before he saw her, the soft, nearly silent pad of paws on the linoleum. She was more cautious tonight. He could feel her hesitation from where he sat. The food was new, the smell was different, richer. And the door was open. That was the biggest variable. The rules of their unspoken agreement had changed. He kept his eyes glued to the same paragraph he'd been trying to read for 10 minutes, not moving a muscle, barely breathing. He could feel her green eyes scanning the dark slit of the doorway, assessing the threat. Then he saw her. A sliver of movement in the crack of the door. A shadow shifting. A small black nose appeared, twitching, sampling the air inside his apartment. He saw one eye, a brilliant, luminous green, peering into his world. It was a profound moment, that single eye looking in. For weeks he had been the one looking out at her, a spectator in his own life, watching a small drama unfold from behind a glass lens. Now the glass was removed. The barrier was down. She was looking in at him, at his silent, half-unpacked life, at the man sitting frozen on the couch trying to look harmless. He felt exposed, seen. She didn't come in. After a long moment of scrutiny, she turned her attention to the food. She ate quickly, efficiently, but he noticed a difference. Before, her eating had sounded hurried, frantic, a creature snatching a meal before danger arrived. Tonight it was purposeful. She was still alert, her ears swiveling at every tiny sound, but she wasn't frantic. She was eating her food from her saucer outside her human's door. The belonging in that thought was sudden and fierce. He pushed it down. He couldn't afford to think like that. Not yet. When she was done, she didn't immediately vanish like she usually did. She sat there on the mat, just on the other side of the doorframe. He could see the clean line of her profile, the way she lifted her head to taste the air coming from his apartment. She began to wash her face, one paw dragging over her ear in that classic, impossibly flexible cat pose. She was settling in, right there, with the door open, with him just 10 feet away. This was the new routine. Every night he'd put out the good food. Every night he'd leave the door open a crack. And every night she'd come, a little earlier, a little less cautious. She started to eat with the door open, her body half turned so she could keep one eye on him. He never moved toward her. He never tried to touch her. He just sat, reading or pretending to read, or sometimes just watching the night sky through his window, giving her the gift of his stillness. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Every cell in his body wanted to reach out, to feel the texture of her fur, to prove to himself she was real, that this connection was real. But he held back. This was her show. He was just the audience, the provider, the quiet, steady presence. He started talking to her again, but now it was out loud, his voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. "Long day, Shadow," he'd say, not looking at her. "The boss was a real jerk." Or, "It's supposed to snow tonight. You got a good spot to hide from it?" He'd tell her about his day, the trivial, boring details of his life that he never shared with anyone. It felt good to voice them, to send them out into the air, to have them heard, even if only by a skittish cat. Sometimes when he'd talk, she'd stop washing, and her ears would twitch in his direction. She was listening. He was sure of it. The days grew shorter, colder. A sharp, metallic tang settled in the air, the smell of winter coming. He found himself worrying about her during the day. Where did she go? Did she have shelter from the wind? Was she warm enough? He bought a small insulated pet bed, the kind with a fuzzy lining. He felt a flush of embarrassment at the checkout counter. He placed it just outside his door next to the food saucer. She ignored it for 3 nights. On the 4th night after she'd eaten, he watched as she circled it, sniffing it suspiciously. She pawed at the fuzzy lining. Then, with a sigh that seemed to travel all the way from her toes, she curled up in it. A perfect tight circle of cat, her nose tucked under her tail. His heart swelled with a ridiculous, profound pride. She was using the bed. His bed. The bond was building, brick by tiny brick, moment by quiet moment. It was in the way she no longer flinched when he shifted on the couch. It was in the way she'd sometimes pause before leaving in the early morning hours and just sit there, in the open doorway, looking at him for a long moment before melting back into the hallway shadows. It was in the way the silence of his apartment was no longer filled with the echoes of his failed marriage, but with the anticipation of her visit. He began to notice the small, specific things about her. The way one of her ears had a tiny V-shaped notch taken out of the tip, a souvenir from a past fight. The way her black fur wasn't solid but had faint ghost-like tabby stripes visible only in a certain light. The way her paws were too big for her skinny legs, making her look a little like a kitten who hadn't grown into them yet. She was no longer a generic stray cat. She was Shadow, an individual, a personality, a creature with a history written on her body in scars and notches, a history he would never fully know. He found himself wondering about that history. Who had she belonged to before? Had she ever known a soft hand, a warm lap? Or had she always been like this, a creature of the margins surviving on her wits and wariness? Had she been loved and lost it? The thought hit him square in the chest. The parallels were too obvious to ignore. He had been loved and lost it too. He had built a life, a shared history, and now it was gone. And he was living in a half-empty apartment, learning how to be alone. Was that why she had chosen him? Not despite his brokenness, but because of it? Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? That they can smell grief on us like rain on the wind? That they see the cracks in our armor and know that's where the light gets in? And maybe that's where they can get in too? One night, a week after the first snow dusted the city, it happened. It was bitterly cold. He could feel the chill seeping through the cracks around the doorframe. He had the door open the usual inch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders as he sat on the couch. Shadow had eaten her dinner and was now performing her lengthy, meticulous washing ritual in her fuzzy bed. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound. He watched her as he always did, feeling a deep sense of calm settle over him. This was enough, he thought. If this is all it ever is, this quiet companionship, this is enough. He must have dozed off. The book slipped from his fingers and thumped softly onto the rug. The sound, small as it was, jolted him awake. He blinked, disoriented for a second. And then he froze. Shadow was there. Not in the hallway. Not on the welcome mat. She was inside his apartment. She was standing just over the threshold, one paw still on the mat outside, the other on the worn wood of his entryway. She was perfectly still, a statue carved from tension and curiosity. Her body was low to the ground, not in a crouch but in a slow, deliberate stalk. Her eyes were huge, fixed on him. He didn't move. He didn't even dare to breathe. This was the line, the uncrossable boundary, and she was crossing it. He watched, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as she took another step. Then another. Her paws made no sound on the floor. She was inside, fully inside. She stopped about 5 feet from him and just looked around. She took in the barren walls, the stack of unpacked boxes in the corner, the couch, the lamp. She was scanning his territory, assessing its safety. Her gaze finally landed back on him. He could see the war in her eyes, the millennia of wild instinct screaming at her to flee, battling against the fragile trust they had built over weeks of patient silence. He did the only thing he could think to do. He slowly, ever so slowly, closed his eyes. In the language of cats, a slow blink is a sign of trust, of affection. It means, I feel safe enough with you to close my eyes. He had read that somewhere, a lifetime ago. He did it now, a long, deliberate closing of his eyes, holding them shut for a count of 3 before opening them again. She was still there, still watching him. Her tail gave one slow, thoughtful twitch. He did it again, closed his eyes. I am not a threat, I am safe. You are safe here. When he opened his eyes the second time, she had taken another step closer. She was now close enough that he could see the individual white hairs mixed into the black fur of her chest. He could see the rise and fall of her breathing. He could see the faint tremor in her front legs, the effort it was taking her to stay. He held his breath. This was it, the moment of truth. The fragile thread between them was pulled taut, humming with tension. And then she did it. She looked directly at him, right into his eyes, and she slowly, deliberately, closed her own brilliant green eyes. She held them closed for a long moment, then opened them again. It was an answer, a confirmation, a silent, perfect I know. The tension in the room shattered, replaced by a warmth so profound it felt like a physical heat. She didn't come any closer. She didn't jump on the couch. She simply turned, with a new casualness, and began to explore the perimeter of the living room, sniffing at the legs of a chair, investigating a cardboard box. She was in his world now. She had crossed over. The trust wasn't complete, not yet. It was still a delicate, newborn thing. But it was there. It was real. Leo let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A single hot tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just sat, watching this small, brave creature explore the edges of his life. And for the first time in a very, very long time, the heavy silence in the apartment was completely and utterly filled with hope. The world inside his apartment had shifted on its axis. It was no longer just his space. It was now a shared territory, a landscape that held the scent and presence of another living thing. After that first night, after she had crossed the threshold and answered his slow blink with one of her own, everything was different. The air itself felt charged with a new, fragile potential. Leo found himself moving through his own home with a new awareness, noticing things he'd long ignored. A dusty sunbeam on the floor that might be warm for a nap. The space behind the couch that looked like a perfect hiding spot. The way the radiator by the window hissed and clanged, promising a coveted heat. He was seeing his world through her eyes, anticipating her needs, her curiosities. The heavy silence was gone, replaced by a constant low hum of anticipation. He was waiting for her. Always waiting for her. She didn't come inside every night. Some evenings, she'd eat her dinner on the mat, perform her ablutions, and simply curl up in her bed in the hallway, as if the effort of crossing into his domain was too much. He didn't force it. He understood. Trust wasn't a light switch you could flip on. It was a tide, ebbing and flowing, and you had to respect its rhythms. On the nights she did come in, it was a slow, careful ballet of exploration. She would slink along the walls, her body low, her tail twitching, mapping the contours of the room with her whiskers, her nose. She'd sniff the legs of the kitchen table for minutes at a time, learning the history of every meal he'd ever eaten there. She'd stare, mesmerized, at the flickering images on the television screen, her head cocked in confusion. Her favorite spot, he quickly discovered, was the radiator by the window. He'd cleared off the pile of mail and books that had been living there, almost unconsciously creating a space for her. The first time she jumped onto the narrow shelf, it was a leap of faith, her skinny legs propelling her upward with a surprising grace. She'd landed, tested the heat with a cautious paw, and then settled into a tight loaf, a low, rumbling purr starting up almost immediately. It was the first time he'd heard her purr. The sound was rough, like a small, rusty engine trying to turn over after a long winter. But to Leo, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. He'd sit in his armchair across the room, pretending to read, just listening to that fragile, rumbling vibration, a sound that seemed to shake the last of the cold out of his own bones. He started buying things for her. It started small, a fuzzy mouse filled with catnip that he tossed gently near the radiator. She'd eyed it with deep suspicion for a full day before batting it tentatively with her paw. Then it was like a switch flipped. The skittish, dignified creature vanished, replaced by a playful, goofy kitten. She'd pounce on the mouse, throw it in the air, bunny kick it with her powerful back legs, letting out little chirps and trills of excitement. Leo would laugh, a real, genuine laugh that felt strange and wonderful in his throat. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He bought a proper food and water bowl, a ceramic set he placed just inside the door. He bought a scratching post, which she ignored completely in favor of the corner of his already tattered couch. He didn't care. He'd wake up in the morning to find her gone, the apartment empty, but now it felt different. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt like she'd just stepped out and would be back. Her bowls were there. Her toy mouse was under the coffee table. The indentation of her small body was still visible on the blanket he'd draped over the radiator shelf. She had left her mark everywhere. And then, the gifts started again. It was a Tuesday 3 weeks after she'd first come inside. He'd woken up, made his coffee, and gone to open the door to get the newspaper. Lying directly in the center of the welcome mat, placed with that same deliberate precision as the first tragic offering, was a single, perfect, crimson leaf. It was from the old maple tree in the parking lot, shaped like a star, its color a vibrant, bloody red against the dull brown of the mat. It was beautiful. It was clean. It was utterly unlike the sodden, dead sparrow. He'd picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. It was a gift. There was no doubt about it. But why? Why a leaf? 2 days later, it was a feather. A long, sleek gray and white barred feather from a pigeon or maybe a dove. It was pristine, unbroken. It lay across the threshold, half in, half out of the apartment. The next week, it was a bottle cap. A red Coca-Cola cap, licked clean, its edges worn smooth. Leo was mystified. The first gift, the bird, had felt like a primal, desperate attempt to provide, to contribute to the survival of the pack. But these were different. They were curated, selected. They were beautiful or interesting or shiny. They felt less like a payment and more like a sharing, a communication. It was as if she was bringing him pieces of her world, the world she inhabited when she wasn't with him. "This is what I see," she seemed to be saying. "This is what I find beautiful. I am bringing it to you." He started a little collection on the windowsill next to her radiator spot. The leaf, the feather, the bottle cap. He didn't know why. It felt important to honor them, to display them. She'd sometimes hop up on the radiator, sniff at her collection, and then look at him, her green eyes unreadable. He'd give her a slow blink. "I see them. Thank you." The mystery of the gifts was one thing. It was charming, heartwarming. But a new pattern began to emerge, one that was far less charming and that planted a seed of cold, gnawing worry in the pit of Leo's stomach. She would vanish. It wasn't the normal daily vanishing act, where she'd leave in the early morning and return at dusk for dinner. Those absences, he understood. She had a life out there, a territory to patrol. Whatever it was stray cats did all day. These were different. These were prolonged disappearances. She'd come for dinner, spend the evening purring on her radiator, and then, instead of curling up in her bed in the hallway or on the rug next to his bed, she'd leave. She'd stand at the open door, look back at him with a strangely determined expression, and then slip out into the night, and she wouldn't come back. Not for 12, sometimes 24 hours. The first time it happened, he'd worried, but he'd told himself he was being ridiculous. She was a cat, a former stray. This was what they did. But when she returned the next evening, she looked different, worn. Not injured, not exactly, but weary in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. Her fur would be faintly dusty, smelling of cold concrete and distant, unfamiliar places. She'd be ravenously hungry, devouring her food with a single-minded intensity he hadn't seen since the early days. Then she'd retreat to her radiator and sleep a deep, motionless coma-like sleep for hours, her purr silent, her body utterly still. He began to dread the determined look in her eye that preceded these journeys. He'd try to coax her to stay, shaking her toy mouse, offering a special treat. But once she got that look, her mind was made up. She had somewhere to be, somewhere that wasn't with him. The worry became a constant ache, a background noise in his mind alongside the warmth of their growing bond. Where did she go? What was she doing? Was she safe? His imagination, fueled by love and fear, conjured up terrible scenarios. He pictured her crawling under abandoned buildings, tangled in barbed wire. He pictured her getting into fights with bigger, meaner animals. He pictured her getting trapped somewhere, cold and alone and waiting for a help that never came. He thought about following her. The idea was tempting, but he dismissed it immediately. If she caught him, if she realized he was spying on her, it would shatter the fragile trust they'd built. It would be a betrayal. He had to respect her secrets even if they were killing him. He had to believe she would come back. He had to have faith in her, but the absences grew longer. One bitterly cold night in December, she didn't return for 2 full days. Leo was a wreck. He couldn't work. He couldn't sleep. He'd open the door every hour, staring out into the empty hallway, the cold air biting at his skin. He'd leave her food out and it would sit there freezing solid, untouched. The silence in the apartment descended again, heavier and more terrible than ever before. It was the silence of absence, the silence of potential loss. He realized with a painful jolt that he couldn't go back to that. He couldn't go back to the man he was before she'd started sleeping outside his door. That man was gone. This man, this worried, loving, terrified man, needed her. When she finally returned on the evening of the second day, she was a mess. She was limping slightly on her front paw, and there was a fresh, angry scratch across her nose. She didn't just look tired. She looked depleted, hollowed out. She wolfed down 2 full cans of food without even looking up, then drank water for a solid minute. She didn't go to the radiator. She walked directly to the blanket on the end of his bed, curled into the tightest ball imaginable, and was asleep before he could even kneel down to check her paw. His heart was breaking. He sat on the floor next to the bed, watching the slow, too deep rise and fall of her breathing. This wasn't right. Something was wrong. This wasn't just the life of a stray cat. This was a compulsion, a mission. She was driven to go somewhere, to do something, and it was costing her. It was hurting her, he had to know. The need to understand, to protect her, overrode his fear of betraying her trust. The next time she got that look, he would follow her. He had to. He told himself it wasn't about spying. It was about love. It was about making sure she was safe. If she was in trouble, he needed to know. If she was hurt, he needed to help. He was her person, and that's what you do for the ones you love. Even if they haven't quite figured out how to love you back yet, you show up for them. You follow them into the dark. The opportunity came a few nights later. A freezing rain was falling, sheeting down the windows, turning the world outside into a blurred, dangerous mess. She'd had a calm day, napping on the radiator, playing with her mouse. But as evening deepened into night, he saw the change come over her. She became restless. She stopped purring. She jumped down from her perch and went to the door, sitting before it like a sentinel, her tail twitching. She stared at the crack of the door, her ears swiveled forward, listening to the icy rain lash against the building. She had that look, the determined, faraway look. A knot of dread tightened in Leo's stomach. Not tonight. Please, not in this weather. But her mind was made up. She turned and looked at him and let out a single soft meow. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like an apology, or a goodbye. Then she turned back to the door and waited. His heart was pounding. This was it. He moved slowly, trying to act normal. He walked to the door, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the knob. He looked down at her. You sure about this, Shadow? he whispered. She just stared at the door, her body coiled with purpose. He opened it. The cold, wet wind blasted into the apartment, carrying the smell of ice and wet concrete. Without a moment's hesitation, she slipped out into the gloomy hallway. She didn't look back. Leo gave her a 10-second head start, his pulse roaring in his ears. This felt wrong. It felt like a violation, but the image of her returning hurt and exhausted steeled his resolve. He grabbed his coat and a flashlight, shoving his feet into his shoes without tying them. He peeked out the door. She was already at the end of the hallway, a gray ghost disappearing down the stairwell. The building had a back stairwell, rarely used, that led out to a dingy alleyway. That was her route. He followed, moving as quietly as he could, his wet sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. The stairwell was cold and smelled of dampness and mildew. He could hear the faint scrabble of her claws on the concrete steps below him. He followed the sound, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He pushed open the heavy metal door that led to the alley. The alley was a canyon of shadows and freezing rain. Water dripped from overflowing gutters, and the wind whipped between the brick buildings, carrying scraps of newspaper and plastic bags. He saw her then, a small, dark shape moving with a swift, sure purpose along the wall, staying in the shadows. She wasn't wandering. She had a destination. He followed, keeping his distance, using dumpsters and parked cars for cover. The cold seeped through his coat. The rain stung his face. He felt a surge of guilt and fear, a potent mix that churned in his gut. What was he doing? He should turn back. This was madness, but he kept going. She led him out of the alley and across a quiet, slick street, into a more run-down part of the neighborhood he rarely visited. This was an area of boarded-up storefronts and chain-link fences. She moved with an unnerving certainty, never hesitating at a corner, never stopping to sniff the air. She knew exactly where she was going. Finally, she stopped. They were in front of an old, abandoned auto body shop. The windows were boarded up and a chain-link fence surrounded the property. But a section of the fence near the ground had been bent back, creating a small, hidden opening. Without a pause, shadow squeezed through the hole and disappeared into the dark, overgrown lot behind the building. Leo's blood ran cold. This was it. This was where she'd been going. This derelict, dangerous place. He ran to the fence, dropping to his knees in the wet, muddy grass. He peered through the hole. The lot was a jungle of weeds and rusted car parts. In the far back corner, tucked against the crumbling brick wall of the building, was a small makeshift shelter, a piece of corrugated metal propped up against a stack of tires. It was a pathetic, desperate-looking thing, barely enough to keep out the wind, let alone the freezing rain now pouring down. And from the dark opening under that piece of metal, he saw two tiny, faint glows, then two more, small, pairs of eyes reflecting the distant streetlight. Shadow was already there, her body silhouetted against the gloom. She ducked her head and disappeared inside the shelter, and from within Leo heard it, faint at first, then growing in intensity. Not one voice but several, high-pitched, desperate, and unmistakable. The sound of mewling, the hungry, insistent cries of kittens. Leo fell back from the fence, sitting hard in the mud, the freezing rain soaking through his pants. The truth washed over him, cold and shocking and profound. She hadn't been leaving him. She hadn't been on some solitary, dangerous mission. She was a mother. She had been coming here to this cold, wet, wretched place, all this time, to feed them, to care for them, to keep them alive. The gifts she brought him weren't just tokens of affection. They were the offerings of a provider, a hunter, a mother who was stretched to her absolute limit, trying to care for two separate families in two separate worlds. The exhaustion, the injuries, the ravenous hunger, it all made a terrible, heartbreaking sense. She wasn't just his shadow. She was their everything, and she had brought him here. She had led him to her deepest, most vulnerable secret. Now he knew. The question that remained, the one that made his hands tremble and his throat tighten with a love so fierce it was almost painful, was what he was going to do about it. The fragile thread between them was no longer just a thread. It was a lifeline, and it was pulling him into the dark, toward the tiny, crying sounds in the night. The sound of the kitten's cries seemed to drill directly into Leo's skull, a high-frequency signal of pure need that overrode every other thought, every other feeling. The freezing rain soaked through his hair, tracing icy paths down his neck, but he didn't feel it. He was numb. He was anchored to the spot. kneeling in the cold mud of the alley, his hands braced against the cold, wet links of the fence, just staring at that pathetic lean-to of corrugated metal and tires. The world had shrunk to this tiny, desperate square of darkness and the tiny, desperate lives hidden within it. She was a mother. The truth wasn't a gentle revelation. It was a physical blow, a sucker punch to the soul that left him breathless. All of it, the exhaustion, the disappearances, the ravenous hunger, the mysterious injuries, it all snapped into a devastating, heartbreaking focus. She wasn't just living a stray cat's life of freedom and danger. She was working. She was sustaining. She was keeping tiny hearts beating against impossible odds. The gifts she brought him, the leaf, the feather, the bottle cap, they weren't just whimsical trinkets. They were the spoils of a hunter, a provider. They were, in her mind, her contribution to the strange, two-legged creature who provided for her so she could, in turn, provide for them. She was splitting her life, her energy, her very being between two worlds, and it was breaking her. A fresh wave of mewling rose from the shelter, sharper, more frantic. It was the sound of hunger, of cold, of a need so basic it was a matter of life and death. The sound pulled Leo out of his stunned paralysis. He couldn't just sit here. He had to do something, but what? His mind raced, tripping over itself, a chaotic jumble of fear and urgency. If he went in there, if he invaded her space, she might panic. She might reject him, or worse, reject the kittens. She might flee and never come back. The trust they had built, brick by painstaking brick over weeks of patient silence, was a delicate crystal thing. One wrong move could shatter it forever. But the alternative was to turn around, to walk away, to go back to his warm, dry apartment and leave her here, in this freezing, wet hellhole, trying to nurse her babies through a winter that was clearly winning. He pictured her lying in there, her body curled around them, her ribs heaving with effort, trying to use her own meager body heat to stave off the cold. He pictured the kittens, their tiny eyes still closed, their mouths open in perpetual silent cries for a warmth that wouldn't come. He couldn't do it. He would never be able to unhear that sound. It would join the heavy silence of his apartment, a new terrible ghost to haunt him. The decision crystallized with a cold, hard clarity. He had to act, but he had to be smart. He had to be gentle. This wasn't a rescue mission with sirens and force. It was a negotiation. It was an offering. He had to speak a language she would understand. He pushed himself up from the mud, his legs shaky and cold. He took one last look at the shelter, committing its location to memory. Then he turned and ran. He ran back through the alley, his feet slipping on the wet pavement, the freezing rain needling his face. He didn't feel the cold. He was burning with a new purpose, a frantic, terrifying energy. He took the stairs back to his apartment 2 at a time, bursting through the door and leaving a trail of muddy water and rain on the floor. He moved through his apartment like a man possessed. He grabbed the softest, thickest blanket he owned, the one from his bed that still carried his scent and her scent, the mingled smell of their shared evenings. He found a sturdy cardboard box and lined it with the blanket, creating a soft, deep nest. Food. She would need food. He grabbed 2 cans of the salmon dinner, the expensive one she loved, and a can opener. Water, a bowl. He shoved it all into a reusable grocery bag, his hands trembling so badly he could barely grip the handles. He paused, his eyes scanning the room, looking for something else, the final piece of the offering. His gaze landed on the windowsill, on her collection, the red leaf, the barred feather, the shiny bottle cap. Without hesitation, he swept them into his palm and dropped them into the box, nestling them into the folds of the blanket. A piece of home, a piece of their home, a signal. Then he was out the door again, running back into the storm, the box tucked under his arm, the bag swinging wildly from his hand. The wind had picked up, howling down the streets, pushing against him as he ran. It felt like the world itself was resisting him, telling him to turn back, to stay in his lane, to not interfere with the brutal natural order of things. But he pushed through it, his breath ragged in his chest, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. He reached the fence, dropped to his knees, and shoved the box and the bag through the hole first. Then he squeezed through himself, the cold metal of the fence snagging on his wet coat. The overgrown lot was even more forbidding up close, a tangle of thorns and rusty metal that grabbed at his pants legs. He moved slowly now, deliberately trying to make his approach calm, non-threatening. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path to the shelter. He stopped about 10 feet away. He could hear movement from inside the lean-to. A low warning growl, not the playful growl she'd sometimes emit with her toy mouse. This was different, primal, a mother's growl. A sound that said, "Come no closer. These are mine." His throat tightened. "Shadow?" He called out, his voice soft, barely above a whisper, but it felt obscenely loud in the tense silence of the lot. "It's me, girl. It's Leo." He set the flashlight down on the ground, pointing it away from the shelter so he wasn't shining it directly at her. He didn't want to blind her, to scare her. He needed her to see him, to see his eyes. He slowly knelt down in the wet weeds, making himself small, non-threatening. He reached into the grocery bag, his fingers fumbling with the cold metal of the can opener. The sound of the can opening, the thwick pop and the subsequent grind of the mechanism seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet. The growling from the shelter stopped. He heard a soft, inquisitive sniff. The smell of the salmon, rich and pungent, cut through the sense of wet dirt and decay. He carefully scooped the food into the bowl he'd brought and placed it on the ground halfway between himself and the shelter. Then he poured fresh water into the other bowl next to it. "I brought you dinner," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Nice hot dinner. Just for you." He waited. Nothing. The only sound was the relentless patter of rain on the corrugated metal roof of her shelter, and the faint, persistent mewling of the kittens. They were still crying. The sound was a physical pain in his chest. He did the only thing he had left. He closed his eyes. He gave her the slow blink. The universal cat sign of trust. "I am not a threat. My eyes are closed. I am vulnerable to you." He held them closed, counting in his head, the rain dripping from his hair down his nose. 1, 2, 3. He opened his eyes. A pair of luminous green eyes was staring at him from the darkness of the shelter's opening. Just her eyes, disembodied in the gloom. They were wide, alert, terrified, but they were watching him. "It's okay," he murmured, keeping his body still. "I'm here to help. I promise." He saw her nose twitch, sampling the air, pulling in the scent of the salmon, the scent of the blanket in the box, the scent of him. He watched, his heart in his throat, as one paw slowly, tentatively emerged from the shelter. Then another. She crept out, her body low to the ground, her ears flat against her head. She was every bit the feral creature he'd first met weeks ago, all instinct and fear. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the bowl of food. She crept to it and began to eat. But it wasn't the relaxed eating of their evenings together. She ate with a frantic, desperate speed, gulping down the food, her body tense, poised for flight. She was starving. She was eating for 4 or 5. He didn't even know how many were in there. While she was distracted, Leo made his move. He didn't approach her. He slowly, inch by inch, pushed the cardboard box closer to the opening of the shelter. He stopped when it was about a foot away. A better offer. A warmer, drier, safer option. Shadow finished the food in record time and immediately started lapping up the water. When she was done, she finally looked up at him. Her gaze went from him to the box and back to him. The fear was still there, but it was mingled with something else. A dawning, exhausted comprehension. She understood why he was here. She had led him here, and he had come. She looked at the box again. Then without a sound, she turned and disappeared back into the shelter. Leo's heart sank. Had he failed? Had he moved too fast? He stayed frozen on his knees, the rain soaking him to the skin, waiting for a sign, for anything. He heard rustling from inside the shelter. A tiny squeaking sound, different from the mewling. Then Shadow emerged again, and carefully, gently, held in her mouth by the scruff of its neck was a kitten. It was impossibly small, a tiny, wet, gray nugget of life. Its eyes were closed, its little legs dangling. She carried it to the cardboard box, leaned over the edge, and deposited it gently into the soft folds of the blanket. The kitten immediately let out a weak squeak and started to squirm. She turned and vanished back into the shelter. Leo couldn't breathe. He couldn't blink. He watched, tears now mixing with the rain on his face as she returned with a second kitten. This one was black and white, a little smaller than the first. She placed it next to its sibling. Then she went back a third time and brought out a third kitten, a tiny calico, all patches of orange and black and white. 3. There were 3. She stood over the box, looking down at her babies who were now mewling and crawling over each other in their new, soft nest. She looked utterly spent, her sides heaving. She looked back at the dark, wet shelter she had called home, and then she looked at Leo. Their eyes met. The rain fell, The wind whispered through the lot, and then she did it. She took one step toward him, then another. She walked slowly, her head low, her tail down. She didn't stop at the food bowl. She walked right up to him where he knelt in the mud. She stopped, her body just inches from his knees. She looked up into his face, her green eyes holding his, and let out a soft, broken sound that was half meow, half sigh. It was a sound of pure, utter exhaustion. It was a sound of surrender. Then she leaned forward, and ever so slowly, with a tenderness that shattered him completely, she pressed the top of her head against his knee. It wasn't a nudge for affection. It wasn't a request for food. It was a gesture of ultimate trust, a benediction, a transfer of weight. It was her saying, "I can't do this alone anymore. I am so tired. I trust you with them. I trust you with me." A sob escaped Leo's throat. He slowly, so slowly it felt like time itself had thickened, brought his hand up. He didn't reach for her. He held his trembling hand in the air, an offering. She held her head against his knee for a moment longer. Then she lifted it and pressed the side of her face, her whiskers into his palm. The feel of her, cold and wet but alive, so vibrantly alive against his skin, was an electric current of connection. He gently, so gently he could barely feel it, curled his fingers stroking the wet fur of her cheek. She leaned into the touch, and for the first time a rough, thrumming purr started up in her chest, vibrating through his hand and up his arm, straight into his own heart. She was trusting him. She was choosing him. Not just as a food source, not just as a safe radiator to sleep on. She was choosing him as her person, as their protector. The moment hung there, suspended in the freezing rain, a perfect, silent understanding between a broken man and a tired mother. The storm hadn't stopped. The world was still cold and dark and dangerous. But in that moment, kneeling in the mud with a purring cat leaning into his hand and her 3 babies mewling in a cardboard box, Leo finally understood what she had been trying to tell him all along. This wasn't a story about a man who rescued a cat. It was a story about a cat who, in her own fierce, mysterious way, had been rescuing him. And now she was asking him to be brave enough to finally, fully rescue her back. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The hardest part was yet to come. But they would do it together. He would bring them all home. The walk home was the longest and shortest journey of Leo's life. The freezing rain had softened to a gentle, misting drizzle, but the wind still cut like a knife. He moved with a surreal, dreamlike slowness, every sense hyper-aware, every step measured and deliberate. In his arms he cradled the cardboard box, holding it level against his chest like a sacred offering, a holy relic. Inside, nestled in the soft folds of the blanket that smelled of him and of home, were the 3 kittens. They were quiet now, lulled by the motion of his walking, a tangle of tiny limbs and soft fur, their bellies full from the formula he'd thankfully thought to grab, their world suddenly reduced to the gentle sway of his gait and the warm, protective darkness of the box, and walking beside him, a silent, determined shadow was Shadow herself. She didn't run ahead. She didn't fall behind. She matched his pace exactly, her body tense, her head on a swivel, her eyes constantly scanning the dark, wet streets for any threat. She was no longer a skittish stray. She was a mother, a guardian, a queen escorting her precious cargo to the safety of a new kingdom. Every few steps she would look up at him, her green eyes checking in, making sure he was still there, that the box was still secure. The trust was absolute, and it was terrifying in its weight. Leo's apartment, when he finally shouldered the door open, felt different. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a sanctuary. It was a nursery. He carried the box to the warmest spot in the living room, next to the hissing radiator, and carefully set it down. He'd already prepared a larger, sturdier box, lined with soft towels and an old sweatshirt. Gently, one by one, he transferred the kittens into their new permanent nest. They mewled softly and protested being moved, their tiny voices like whispers in the sudden, profound quiet of the room. Shadow leaped effortlessly into the box after them, circling once, twice before settling down and immediately gathering the squirming, blind babies close to her belly. She began to wash them with a fierce, devoted intensity, her rough tongue smoothing their damp fur, her purr starting up again, that rusty, rumbling engine of contentment and relief. She was home. They were home. They were safe. Leo sank onto the floor beside the box, his back against the radiator, his entire body trembling with a cocktail of adrenaline, exhaustion, and overwhelming love. He watched them. He just watched them. The rise and fall of Shadow's breath as she nursed them, the tiny kneading paws of the kittens against her side. The way the smallest one, the calico, would let out a tiny squeak before finding its place. This was his life now, this messy, complicated, beautiful chaos. The heavy silence was gone, banished forever, replaced by the soft symphony of purrs and mewls and the quiet hum of a radiator keeping a family warm. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and profound joy. Leo's apartment was transformed. The half-unpacked boxes were finally put away, not out of a sudden urge to organize, but to make room for a sprawling cat tree, for a collection of tiny toys, for a labyrinth of cardboard boxes with holes cut in them. The air smelled of kitten formula and warm fur, a scent Leo found he loved more than any perfume. He learned their personalities as their eyes opened, revealing baby blue eyes that would later change color. The gray one, the firstborn, was the bold explorer, always the first to clamber out of the nest, his tiny tail a question mark of curiosity. Leo named him Scout. The black and white one was the gentle giant, the biggest of the litter. With a rumbling purr that was comically large for his body, he was content to stay close to his mother, a calm, peaceful presence. Leo named him Panda. The calico, the smallest, was a fierce, sassy little princess. She had a tiny meow that she used with impressive frequency, demanding attention, food, the best spot at the milk bar. Her patchwork fur was a work of art. Leo named her Pixie and Shadow. Shadow blossomed. The constant tension in her body melted away. The scratches on her nose healed. The patchy fur grew in thick and glossy, a deep, luxurious black. She ate with relish, not with desperation. Her body slowly filling out, no longer just skin and bone, but strength and grace. She was a devoted, attentive mother. But she was also, for the first time, able to just be a cat. She would leave the kittens napping in their box and jump onto the radiator, stretching out in a patch of sun. Her purr a contented thrum. She'd play with her toy mouse again, batting it around the floor with a lightness he'd never seen before. But the most profound change was in her eyes. The wild, fearful glint was gone, replaced by a deep, serene calm. She would look at him, and it was a look of utter, unshakable trust. She would follow him from room to room, not out of anxiety, but out of companionship. She'd curl up on the end of his bed while he read, or sit on the windowsill next to him while he drank his coffee in the morning, just sharing the quiet space. She was home. Truly, completely home. The kittens grew fast. Their world expanded from the box to the entire living room, a vast landscape of towering furniture and exciting, crinkly toys. Leo's life was no longer his own. It was a whirlwind of playtime and feedings and laughing as he watched them discover their world. Scout would try to climb the curtains. Panda would somehow get himself stuck inside a shoe. Pixie would demand to be held, mewing imperiously until Leo picked her up and let her snuggle against his neck, her tiny purr vibrating against his skin. He found himself talking to them, telling them stories, singing them silly songs. The silence was a distant memory. His apartment was now filled with life, with sound, with love. The grief that had been a constant heavy stone in his chest was still there, but it was no longer the center of his existence. It was a memory, a part of his history, but it didn't define him anymore. He was too busy living. He was Leo, the guy who worked from home and had to explain the occasional kitten walking across his keyboard during video calls. He was Leo, who had 3 alarm clocks that meowed for breakfast at 5 a.m. He was Leo, whose heart was full. He knew, of course, that he couldn't keep them all. His apartment was too small, his salary not nearly large enough for 4 cats. It was the one cloud in his otherwise sunny sky. He'd have to find them homes. Good, loving, perfect homes. The thought was a physical pain, but he pushed it aside. He had time. For now, they were his. One evening, about 2 months after he'd brought them home, he was sitting on the floor surrounded by kittens. Scout was chasing a laser dot up the wall. Panda was asleep in his lap, a warm, purring weight, and Pixie was engaged in a fierce battle with a feather wand. Shadow was watching it all from her perch on the couch, her eyes half closed in contentment, the picture of maternal pride. Leo reached over to the windowsill, to the small collection of treasures he'd kept there. The red leaf had crumbled, but the barred feather and the bottle cap were still there. He picked up the feather, twirling it in his fingers. He looked at Shadow. "Remember this?" he said softly. You brought this to me." She blinked her slow blink at him, her tail giving a gentle flick. He smiled. The gifts had stopped once she'd moved inside. She no longer felt the need to bring him offerings from the outside world because she had given him the ultimate gift, herself and her family. Her work was done. Later that night, after the kittens had finally collapsed into a purring pile in their bed and Shadow had taken her spot on the radiator, Leo got ready for bed himself. He was brushing his teeth when he heard it, a soft, familiar thud from the living room. It was the sound of something small and light hitting the floor. He paused, listening. Maybe one of the kittens had knocked a toy off the couch. He finished up and walked into the living room. The room was dark, lit only by the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The kittens were sound asleep. Shadow was on her radiator watching him, her eyes glowing in the dim light. There, in the middle of the floor, right in the exact spot where he used to place her food saucer, was a new gift. He walked over and knelt down. It was a sprig of pine, fresh and green with a small, perfect, tightly closed pine cone attached to the end. It smelled of the outdoors, of cold air and earth. It hadn't been there moments before. The window was closed. The door was locked. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the rough, textured scales of the tiny pine cone. He looked over at Shadow. She was still watching him, her head tilted. She let out a soft, questioning murp. And in that moment he understood. This wasn't an offering from a provider. This wasn't a payment. This was different. This was a message. A final, perfect communication. She had not left this apartment in 2 months. She had everything she needed right here. The only way she could have gotten this was if she had stashed it away weeks ago, back when she was still living her double life, and had hidden it somewhere in the apartment. Under the couch, behind a bookshelf. She had saved it. And tonight, for a reason known only to her, she had retrieved it and brought it to him. A final gift from that time. A reminder of the journey. A symbol of resilience, a green living thing that thrived in the coldest of seasons. It was her way of saying, "I remember. Thank you for remembering me." Tears welled in Leo's eyes, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He looked from the pine sprig in his hand to the cat on the radiator, to the 3 sleeping kittens in their bed. The circle was complete. The story had found its ending. Or rather, its beautiful, messy, perfect beginning. He would keep them, all of them. He would find a way. He would get a second job if he had to. He would move to a bigger apartment. He would make it work. Because they weren't just cats. They were his family. They were the gift he never knew he needed. The miracle that had walked into his life on silent pause and taught him how to live again, how to love again, how to fill the silence not with noise, but with meaning. He placed the pine sprig back on the windowsill next to the feather and the bottle cap. It was the newest treasure in their collection. The final piece. He crawled into bed, and a few moments later he felt the familiar dip of the mattress. Shadow jumped up, circled once on the blanket next to him and settled down with a deep, contented sigh. Down the hall he could hear the soft sounds of the kittens sleeping. Leo closed his eyes, a smile on his face. The apartment was quiet, but it was a quiet filled with life. It was the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of home. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep into his soul that sometimes the greatest gifts don't come wrapped in pretty paper. They come scarred and scared, left on your doorstep in the dead of night. They come with trust earned in whispers and slow blinks. They come with tiny, crying voices that lead you out of your own darkness and into the light. And if you're brave enough to open the door, if you're patient enough to wait, if you're kind enough to listen, you might just find that you weren't the one doing the rescuing at all. You were the one being found. You stayed till the end, thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.